U.S. President Donald Trump started his second term in office with rapid-fire coercive economic measures that put rivals and allies alike on the back foot. As a countermeasure, many in Europe and China started hoping for an improvement in the frayed relations between Beijing and Brussels. But 6 months on, and despite a recent summit, rapprochement seems as elusive as ever. So, what is the future of EU-China economic relations? And what does that mean for Taiwan? I'm Tomasz Koper, and this is Connected on Taiwan Plus. Helping us untangle the complex economic and geopolitical relations between the European Union and China are Andreas Fulda, Associate Professor at Nottingham University, and joining us from Berlin is Claus Soong, an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Andreas, let me start with you. How do you see the state of EU-China relations in mid-2025, which is, a few months into Donald Trump's second term as president?
Yeah, the European Union really is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It faces a real geopolitical storm. Transatlantic relations are in trouble. We're dealing with a very unpredictable Trump. At the same time, European member states still struggle from weaning themselves off Russian gas. And our economies remain deeply entangled with China's economy. And that creates all sorts of dependencies which we haven't really tackled.
Well, Claus, a lot of hopes were riding on the recent EU-China summit that was originally scheduled to take place in Brussels, but eventually took place in Beijing. But many saw the result of that summit as rather meager. What's your take on the outcomes?
I think the summit was highly expected to achieve something, probably mostly from the European side. However, we see that what China and the EU achieved was on the climate agreement. And it's expected to see that because before the summit doesn't expect to see a major compromise on an economic security issue concern for the Europeans they would get from the Chinese side. And what we see is maybe on the bilateral relationship, who needs who more? It's more clear that it is European need Beijing more rather than vice versa. And we see the change here that not the change here, but we see the differences here on the result that actually Beijing did not give in or to tackle any concern for the European. Their major concern, no matter the economic on overcapacity or the security-wise on China's alignment with Russia.
Andreas, what is your take on how the summit went, and what is the next step then?
I would basically agree with Claus, but perhaps be a little bit less charitable. In my view, the summit was a failure. Having a joint statement on climate change doesn't amount to much. The real issues are indeed economic and security-wise. And the Chinese Communist Party has made it very clear, actually, through their foreign minister, Wang Yi, that they have no interest in Russia losing the war in Ukraine. But for Europe, this is, of course, a very different equation, and we have no interest in Russia winning the war. And so these are actually incompatible interests between the EU and China.
We'll dig into the geopolitics and the Chinese support for Russia a little later in the program. First, I want to take a look at what's at stake for both China and the European bloc. For years now, Europe has been buying more from China than selling to it. The trade deficit showed some signs of shrinking in the mid-2020s until it ballooned again in the wake of the pandemic and is now still at twice the level it was before COVID. For the EU, China is the biggest source of goods, representing 21% of imports, but it's only the third market European companies sell to, after the United States and the United Kingdom. So, Claus, what is driving this growing trade deficit with China? I'm guessing it's not all COVID-era face masks.
Indeed. I think that we are seeing overcapacity spreading around, sourcing from China to spread around in different markets. And I think European market is one of the zone where we see the flooding of the Chinese goods to get into. EV is part of it. But we're also seeing that in terms of the trade balance, it's growing compared to the past in a pre-COVID era, and European industry is suffering more from the competition with the Chinese imports.
Andreas, has China signaled at all any willingness to address this trade imbalance? And if so, what are the tools that are available to both sides to do that?
Trade imbalances have been a sticking point for many years, if not decades. So none of these concerns are new. What is also clear is that the Chinese government is not willing to address these imbalances. China's economy remains very much export-oriented. By the way, this is also the case for Germany, where I'm from. And one of the structural problems is how do you shift from an export-oriented economy to one that is more domestic consumption-based? And actually, both China and Germany have struggled on that front because it requires very deep structural reforms, almost a reordering of the economy for which the current Chinese leadership has very little appetite.
Claus, we've seen at the same time a big uptick in Chinese investments in the EU, and this is for the first time in nearly a decade. And Merix has recently published a report analyzing these investments. Can you tell us how they differ from what we've seen in the past?
So I think now we're seeing that the Chinese investment in Europe have a shifting on in the countries, in geographic countries. So in the past, it was mostly in the more advanced economies within the EU, and now you see a more political targeted investment destination. For example, Hungary become a new destination of Chinese investment, that you see the pouring of the Chinese investment into EU. And we also see on the industry-wise that greenfield has been a new sources of where Chinese investment goes to. And this increase the Chinese ability to leverage within European Union, and especially targeting the country that have a friendlier posture to a Chinese foreign policy need.
Do you think those are serious investments, long-term investments, or are they more, local assembly lines, offshore assembly lines for Chinese companies?
So I think that a proper way to see that is that this investment is a way for the Chinese good to get into the European market without facing tariff and without facing other measure that targeting on Chinese goods. And other than its political needs, economic-wise, I think that these investment provide a certain long-term solution for Chinese goods to sell in Europe. And I think this could be seen as a similar practice we see in the Chinese business invest in different countries. For example, Southeast Asia, right? When going through other countries, the Chinese goods are sold through to a different market by investment in foreign countries.
Well, speaking of investing and entering markets, European companies still struggle with high entry barriers and regulatory barriers when entering the Chinese market. And there are voices in Europe asking, why aren't we doing the same? Andreas, what do you think?
Yeah, we actually have a really paradoxical situation given China's state-led economy, industry policy. Think of Made in China 2025. There are now calls to basically copy the Chinese model and to also ensure that we are keeping our industries or better even reshoring them and making Chinese investment conditional on, for example, a localization quota where they have to ensure a certain number of people who are employed and also ensure technology transfer, things that the Chinese Communist Party has done very skillfully over the past 30 years. I'm not quite sure whether it will work within the context of our own regulatory environment, which is still very much open to business, despite some hurdles that have been set up to prevent unfair competition.
Another opinion that I've heard related to this set of relationships that we have or that Europe has with China is that unless Europe protects its industries, it will lead in a few short years to deindustrialization. I see you both nodding there, but is that a realistic scenario? I mean, it seems quite improbable that in a few years Europe could go from a highly industrialized to a situation where industries are shrinking. Klaus, what do you think?
I agree that if Europe doesn't protect its own industry, it will get wiped out by a Chinese competitor in the coming years. Shorter or later, it's just a matter of time. I think EV, for example, is a good indicator to show us that if Europe does not protect its own industry, we will see the Chinese impact. Chinese make better or cheaper and better vehicles, electro vehicles, and we are seeing certain major European car making companies are closing their factories within Europe while still putting on investment in China. This tells us something, that if Europe does not protect its industry with proper measure, it cannot compete fairly with the Chinese industry flooding into Europe. And this will have detrimental effect to not just the economic interest, but also social stability within Europe.
Well, Europe did try to protect its industries, especially against cheap Chinese EVs by introducing tariffs. However, since those rules were introduced, the number of Chinese EVs registered in Europe has doubled. So what is happening, Andreas? Are we not going, or is Europe not going far enough?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I've commented on tariffs in the EV sector, and my critique was always that the tariffs are too low. Actually, we're seeing a repeat of the solar panel debacle in 2012. There was also a looming trade war. The Europeans did impose tariffs, but they were also too low. And as a consequence, actually, the photovoltaic sector was wiped out. The German industry was world leading. It's non-existent now. Also, Europe doesn't have capabilities to restart that industry. We're now almost completely dependent on solar panels made in China. And so for the automobile sector to see a repeat of this policy failure is quite something. And again, I should point out that it was the former German Chancellor Scholz who actually lobbied Brussels against imposing high tariffs. And it's quite clear to me that some of these automobile manufacturers who are now manufacturing in China were actually, this was in their interest. They don't really care where they produce cars as long as they can export them and sell them to customers.